Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stephen Nelson, and I'm Dean of the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts here at the National Gallery of Art. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to the fourth and final 75th A.W. Mellon Lecture in the Fine Arts featuring Dr. Mabel O. Wilson from Columbia University. Before I invite Professor Wilson up, I would actually just like to say a couple of thank yous. It took a lot of people to put this together, and I would like to thank the center team, specifically Associate Dean Kyra Cabañas, Gary Calcagno, Jen Rakowski, Natalie Mesa, and Sarah Bohannon for their work in making all of this run. We couldn't do it without them. I tip my wig to you people, right? I would also like to thank our colleagues in Visitor Experience and AV for all of the support they've given us. I would also like to thank our ASL interpreter, Billy Sims. Thank you. Without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Wilson to the lectern.
Good afternoon. Great. Welcome, and I want to say thank you for joining me this Sunday. It's absolutely glorious Sunday afternoon here at the National Gallery's East Wing Auditorium, and also just want to thank folks who are online because this is also being simulcast. And so very much appreciate those who might be tuning in the first time and those who have I've been trying to think of like the Real Housewives of, the narrative I've been telling all along. But I do want to thank Billy, who's done an amazing job as the interpreter. And I also want to thank all of those at the National Gallery, Dr. Stephen Nelson in particular, for the invitation to come, and again, all of the folks behind the scenes that have made this possible. Also, for this last lecture in the series, I want to give a special thanks to my colleagues at Columbia University, whose intellectual generosity really helped this project come into fruition, and I would say whose unwavering dedication to truth and scholarship, to ethical pedagogy, and to public service to not only our students and communities inside and out and beyond the gates stands as a model for all who teach and research. This early 19th century watercolor contrasts the newly completed Washington city against its surrounding countryside of verdant rolling hills and sparsely populated farmhouses. And while this area comprised Capitol Hill, where most of the government buildings were located, the city's character retained many of its rural attributes of nearby farms and plantations, whose enslaved field hands harvested tobacco, wheat, corn, grasses, and other crops for market. In black ink and reddish hues, the watercolor illustrated Washington City's 2- and 3-story brick residential, commercial, and civic buildings. And in the foreground, perhaps to highlight the rural character of early Washington City, 2 steer were captured grazing on a small plot of grass at President Square, where F Street terminated at 15th Street Northwest. Amateur artist Baroness Anne Marguerite Hyde de Neuville populated her panorama with men, women, and children going about their daily activities in Washington City. A rare depiction of early US life, she painted in detail 6 Black men, women, and children at work. Two black men, for instance, drive carriages ferrying white passengers. Their livery suits, tall hat, waistcoat, and jacket were the typical dress of coachmen of the period. Elsewhere in her tableau, two black female servants, perhaps domestic workers or cooks from a nearby home or a tavern, hold conversation outside a walled yard. The women don gray cotton dresses, possibly made of Osnaburg, a very common fabric purchased by enslavers to not only clothe, but to identify the women as human property. Now note, the women wrap their hair in cloth in a manner akin to what in Haiti was called a tignon, and perhaps they purchased this fabric with extra monies earned by selling vegetables from their provision gardens. And in the background of this rare depiction of black female sociality appears a sheet hanging from a window. This detail gives a hint as to how the inner blocks of the city became sites of black labor and social life. Now, next door to the bank, another black man, perhaps a porter or possibly a hostler, that's who's in charge of horses back then, emerges from a lower level to assist with the ferrying of deliveries or perhaps of packages. Now, this building had once been home to the Little Hotel, one of the city's first to offer temporary lodgings to visitors, a topic I discussed in last week's lecture. Now, upon further scrutiny, the three buildings in the watercolor may seem rather ordinary or unremarkable. Now, Yves de Neuville frames the left side of her watercolor with the monumental east wing of the US Treasury building that towered over 15th Street. In its recent renovation after the devastating British invasion in the summer of 1814, had engaged the talents of white immigrant architects James Hoban of Ireland, George Hadfield of England, Italy, and Benjamin Henry Latrobe of England. Just to the west of the Treasury building and outside the frame sat the President's House, designed by architect Builder Hoban, who also superintended its construction, including the hire of its enslaved carpenter Peter, the subject of last week's lecture. Now, across from the Treasury building, Yves de Neuville paints two white women, dressed in bonnets and cotton sheets popular at the time. Shaded by their parasols, they find relief from the blaring August heat. Also, along F Street, another white woman watches a girl entertain herself with rolling a hoop. The women and child illustrate how the city had become home for upper and middle class white families who'd settled there because of their affiliations with government institutions and the burgeoning commercial economy that was tied to land speculation, construction, and trade. Now, at the center of this scene, Yves de Neuville painted two well-dressed white men in conversation at the entrance of the Bank of Metropolis, a sign of the growing importance of the federal city as a center of finance. The bank, founded in 1814, was located in the former home of Rhodes Tavern that had occupied the brick house from 1802 to 1805. And you could see on the right side of the watercolor, Yves de Neuville shows part of the building that had once been home to the Little Hotel, as I said, one of the city's first hotels, owned and built by James Hoban and his Irish business partner, Pierce Purcell. It is also possible that Hoban's enslaved laborers, some of whom were carpenters, Ben, Daniel, Harry, or Peter, or Purcell's enslaved laborers, James, Tom, and Tony, built some of the interior walls and cabinetry of the three-story brick structure. And I should also say, Hoban and Purcell were also involved in brick production as well, so they could have made some of the bricks for the building. So in the early years of the city's construction, the three commissioners of public buildings, a group appointed by President George Washington to oversee the construction of the new federal city from 1791 to roughly 1801, commandeered the Little Hotel and Rhodes Tavern's main rooms as meeting halls to conduct governmental business, including the routine auctions of city lots. So these were, interesting enough, some of the first sort of government buildings were actually, these kind of taverns and hotels. The Baroness painted her watercolor, entitled The Corner of F Street, Washington, Opposite Our House, Summer 1817, from a vantage point where she lived with her husband, Jean-Guillaume de Neuville, the ambassador to France. Now, her husband wrote in his memoirs that arriving in Washington city, that he was, quote, surprised to find a town only half built, and of such vast extent that in order to get from one part to another, you had to pass through long spaces, which cannot be called streets, the houses so few and far between, end quote. So again, that gives you a sense of the rural character of the city. Former members of an exiled French aristocracy, the Ile de Neuville socialized with their F Street neighbors who were the Washington elites. And this group counted as members one of the architects of the US Capitol, superintendent of patents, and former commissioner physician William Thornton and his wife Anne Brudeau Thornton. And they lived actually one block east on F Street. The most esteemed members of the social circle were President James Madison and First Lady Dolly Madison, who also at one time had been next-door neighbors of the Thorntons on F Street. And I love these Gilbert Stuart because you can see it must have been the rage to be painted in the same red chair as a couple. So with an eye for the details of everyday life, like showing the carriages that ferried residents and visitors through the city, Ile de Neuville illustrated a variety of social and work activities that animated the streets of her neighborhood in the summer of 1817. And her watercolor offers a rare illustration of the class, gender, and racial contours of Washington City's public spheres. It especially makes evident how those public spaces intersected with the domestic interiors, like the second floor window from where the French aristocrats spied her neighbors and strangers. And it may be this is a painting of the house that she may have lived in at the time. And precisely in those streets were those who were free to move about, and those whose movements were surveilled and constrained by the city's slave codes. So my fourth and last lecture today explores Washington City's growing free, Black, and enslaved community who lived and labored within its new public and domestic spaces. And to ensure free Blacks no longer posed a detrimental influence on their enslaved property, or represented a threat of retribution for the violence meted out to keep them enslaved, or a reminder of the immoral institution that slavery persisted paradoxically in the metropolis of liberty, private citizens and city leaders formalized a colonization plan to encourage voluntary deportation, or self-deportation, to use today's terms, of free Blacks to the African continent. The colonizers' fantasy, quote, the colonizers' fantasy was an America not so much free of slavery, but free of free Blacks, end quotes, as historian William G. Thomas III succinctly puts it. So we will follow Black residents like Ann Williams, an enslaved domestic, and how she navigated a dangerous milieu as the city became a popular way station on the infamous trail of slave traders looking to buy slaves and kidnap free persons to auction in slave markets deep into the American South. Nonetheless, early Black Washingtonians shared knowledge and formed networks of support within the liminal spaces of garrets and alleyways, away from the surveillance regimes, which allowed for the aspiration of freedom to be imagined and then pursued. However, as we shall learn from Williams' story, freedom won by law or flight was not an easy undertaking or without lifelong consequences. Quote, "They brought me away with my 2 children and wouldn't let me see my husband. They didn't sell my husband and I didn't want to go. I was so confused and distracted that I didn't hardly know what I was about, but I didn't want to go, and I jumped out of the window. But I am sorry now that I did. They have carried off my children, off with them to Carolina," end quote. Was how Ann Williams recalled to physician Jesse Torrey the chain of events that left her severely incapacitated and unable to walk. From Torrey's vantage point, quote, "She attempted to escape by jumping out of the window of the garret of a 3-story brick tavern on F Street. About daybreak in the morning and in the fall, she had her back and both arms broken," quote. Slave traders had jailed Williams, age 24, in the attic of Miller's Tavern in Washington City. Williams was joined by a young man, a woman, and her 2 daughters, also awaiting incorporation into a coffle, a group of slaves chained together as they headed to southern slave markets. Torrey recounted his conversation with Williams, though she's only identified as the Black woman, in his 1817 publication, A Portraiture of Domestic Slavery in the United States. Torrey encountered Williams while he was on a fact-finding mission in Western Virginia and southwestern Maryland. Torrey was determined to witness firsthand the horrors of human bondage on plantations and within the networks of the slave trade. Over the course of his stay in the nation's capital, Torrey got wind of a recent incident where an enslaved woman had jumped from a window of a notorious establishment patronized by slave traders, who used its compound as a slave pen. On December 20th, 1815, Torrey, as per her account, dispatched to Miller's Tavern on the corner of F and 14th Streets Northwest to witness the, quote, "mangled slaved before she should be buried," end quote. But what Torrey discovered, however, was that the woman, Ann Williams, had not died, but survived her devastating fall some weeks prior. Keen on documenting the details of her predicament, Torrey interviewed Williams, although he, as did many others after him, never identified the young mother by name. So how did Williams end up captive in Miller's garret? In late November of 1815, slave traders marched Ann Williams' 2 daughters through Washington City on their way to slave markets somewhere in the South, possibly North Carolina. The 2 girls were never seen by their parents again. And shortly thereafter, Ann Williams was supposed to depart Miller's Tavern in a different coffle, heading to Georgia. Her mood, as she related to Torrey, was frantic and confused. She tried to escape her predicament by jumping out of the window of the 3rd floor garret, where she was being held by a slave trader aided by George Miller and Miller's son. Now, whether Williams attempted to flee her situation was motivated by the need to find her daughters, to abscond to freedom, or perhaps to die by suicide remains unknown. Also unclear from accounts was whether she ever saw her husband, who remains unidentified in these accounts. Williams told Torrey, quote, "They brought me away with 2 of my children and wouldn't let me see my husband. They didn't sell my husband, and I did not want to go," end quote. Their Maryland enslaver, who lived near Bladensburg, I apologize for those Marylanders out there, had not sold her husband to slave traders. The division of Anne Williams' family by enslavers and traders illustrates how kinship was meaningless in the face of the necessary exchangeability of the enslaved, whose market value depended on a person's productive and reproductive capacity, the latter characterized predatorily as a female slave's increase. Now, for a portraiture of domestic slavery, published a year later, Torrey hired illustrator Alexander Ryder to create a series of images, including one for Williams' story, emblematic of the, quote, "multiple horrors added to slavery when its victims are bought and sold," end quote. Now, Ryder, who most likely never met Williams or visited the site of her fall, depicted an out-of-scaled Black woman floating eerily in midair above a vacant F Street. To heighten her otherworldliness, the artist illuminated her white frock with the oblique rays of the rising sun. The caption below the illustration paraphrased Williams' confession, quote, "But I did not want to go, and I jumped out of the window," end quote. Torrey and Ryder seized upon Williams' story and transformed her into an angelic cipher whose tragedy spoke volumes about the evils of slavery. In service of representing the promise of Enlightenment civilization and Christian charity, her badly abused body became the means through which the precarity of American virtue, corrupted by the immoral twins of profit and pleasure that shaped all facets of slave trade, was made visible. Through narrative and image, the decline of national character was superimposed onto the tragic escape of an unnamed enslaved Black woman. Now, after her catastrophic fall that badly damaged her spine, broke both arms, and left her permanently disabled, Williams had nowhere to go. She was unable to be chained in a coffle and was instead carried back to the garret. The house's cramped attic, whose sloping walls kettled heat in the summer and failed to buffer the damp chill of the winter, made an ideal slave pen because it was precisely away from the main rooms of the house, and its location prevented easy escape. Like the dank cellar or the stable where slaves were also kept, these liminal spaces found within a typical Washington City row house proved easily adaptable into pens for holding enslaved persons waiting export from the region. Though Williams was attended by local physicians, Benjamin King and W. Jones, her debilitating injuries rendered her unsellable as a field hand or a domestic servant, as had been her duties on Maryland plantations. And on the same day that she leapt from the window, tavern owner George Miller purchased Williams for $5 from a slave trader named John, whose last name remains unidentified in records. Because her extensive injuries and psychological anguish, Williams, now owned by Miller, was left to recuperate on a pallet rolled out on the wood plank floor of the garret, where she probably stayed for several weeks. But in her prison abode, Williams was not alone. Joining Williams jailed in the garret were 3 freed Black persons from Delaware. The 3 had been kidnapped by gangs and sold to slave traders who patronized Miller's Tavern's way station. Rosanna Brown and John Parker also shared their stories with Torrey the same day that he had interviewed Anne Williams. For a portraiture of domestic slavery, and you can see this was the view, and that is Anne Williams on the pallet on the floor. And for a portraiture of domestic slavery, Torrey commissioned Ryder to also illustrate the scene of the 4 captives in the garret and also the chaotic kidnapping of Brown and her daughter. 3 days after Torrey visited the badly injured Williams, only to also stumble upon 3 kidnapped free people in the attic, he enlisted the help of local attorney and enslaver Francis Scott Key and 2 other attorneys. It is unclear how long the slave traders kept Parker and the Browns in the Miller's garret. By the June 1816 session of the Circuit Court in Washington City, Torrey, with the assistance of Key, had gathered evidence that Parker and the Brown family, including the daughter Rosanna Brown birthed while in captivity, were legally free persons. Torrey acknowledged that the geography of slavery and the slave trade and the nefarious behavior that it cultivated was, from his perspective, both profoundly unchristian and disappointingly undemocratic. He wrote, quote, "The sable Africo-American shook his manacles at the conservators of the rights of man while he was dragged through the city of liberty," end quote. Thus, how might the stewards of the new government best address this ethical paradox of enslavement that pervaded their new city of liberty? Moral corruption was one factor. The other core issue at stake in the emerging domestic slave markets through which William and her daughters were trafficked was what to do with the increasing population of free Blacks living there and within other cities along the Middle Atlantic. Maryland and Virginia's tobacco landscape had disappeared due to the soil's nutrient depletion. Planters turned to the cultivation of crops like grains that required fewer laborers. This left planters with a surplus of slaves that required food, clothing, and housing. With changing regional agricultural labor needs and the lucrative empire of cotton plantations, ones that needed large number of slaves expanding across the Mississippi Valley, enslaved men, women, and children were sent to markets to pay debts or when they could no longer be profitable. Of equal importance, especially after the Revolutionary War, the Middle Atlantic states of Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, and New York became home to a growing free Black population. Enslaved men and women sought various avenues to purchase their freedom. It permitted some men and women to squirrel away monies earned by selling goods or their labor, like the enslaved sawyers that James Hoban employed at the President's House and U.S. Capitol building sites. Others were manumitted by an enslaver who agreed on various terms to free them upon his or her death. And still others, like Ona Judge, owned by Martha Washington, or First Lady Martha Washington, took the risk of flight and escaped the region altogether to live free in northern states or Canada. Significantly, it's in its first 20 years, while Washington City's enslaved population doubled from 3,244 to 6,377, so it's almost an exact doubling, its free Black population increased almost sixfold, from 739 to 4,048. So free Black residents had been a part of Washington cities from its very beginning. Throughout the construction period of Washington cities, the commissioners and the various superintendents hired a small number of unskilled and skilled free Black workers. Jacob Butler, Edward Butler, Rudy Butler, Isaac Butler, who was a young boy, Joshua Ellis, Thomas Smith, Caesar Hall, Jeremiah Jerry Holland, and others worked regularly, often on yearly or quarterly contracts at the President's House and the U.S. Capitol through 1802. Now, it should be noted that after working at the U.S. Capitol and with the surveying department, Jerry Holland became a personal servant to Commissioners William Thornton, Gustavus Scott, and Alexander White. Holland lived in a small structure in the interior of Block 224 behind the commissioner's office, the commissioner's office located in one of Hoban's buildings on F Street between 15th and 14th Street Northwest. Hoban lived nearby with 6 other people and 4 enslaved persons, though we do not know if these were the enslaved carpenters Ben, Daniel, Harry, or Peter. It is also unclear how Holland gained his freedom, but the 1800 census records of Ward 2 shows that he lived in the area, probably this block, with 6 other freed people, perhaps family members. So beginning in the fall of 1815, shortly before Anne Williams failed escape, James and Grace Dant became free people. The husband and wife lived on the same block as Holland, between F and G Streets Northwest and 14th and 15th Streets Northwest. This block, 224, explored in last week's lecture, was where James Hoban and partner Pierce Purcell owned several lots and built speculative brick townhouses with gardens and stables that they rented. Purcell owned James and Grace Dant. Now, it could be that James Dant was James, the enslaved carpenter who may have been transported by Purcell from Charleston. James appears on the carpentry timesheets of the U.S. Capitol when he would have been around the age of 22. Purcell manumitted his slaves upon his death on September 10th of 1815. Reflective of how slavery severed kinship ties, their son, Jerry Dant, was not freed, but was instead willed to Purcell's sister and was to be manumitted upon her death. To remain close to their son, the couple may have moved into 2 rooms with a garden in the rear of a brick house at the corner of G Street and 14th Street Northwest. This was a dwelling that Purcell had rented for several years to a free Black woman named Celia, whose last name is unknown. These rooms all faced the interior of Block 224, which, like most of the blocks, had a 30-foot wide interior alley where free and some enslaved Black families made their homes. Jerry Holland, as I said, was their neighbors, and they would have looked onto the back of the Bank of Metropolis compound as depicted in E. de Neuville's watercolor. Holland and the Dants probably resided there when Anne Williams tried to escape through the 3rd floor window of nearby Miller's Tavern in November of 1815. Now, in his will, Pierce Purcell bequeathed all buildings on lots 13 and 12 to his nephew, though stipulated that if his nephew wished to evict the Dants from the rear of the house, then he was required to build a small house on a section of a nearby lot that he gave to the Dants. That house, which would front onto G Street, was described by Purcell in his will as a 1-room structure, most likely built out of wood. The house was to be 14 feet wide and 16 feet deep, with a brick chimney and with a large shed attached. This was different from the typical 2- and 3-story brick row houses built by Hoban, Purcell, and other speculators rented to merchants like Miller. Purcell's detailed description of the modest wooden house for the Dants characterized the types of dwelling occupied by free Blacks and poor whites living in Washington City. Through the careful research, art historian John Davis has determined that some of the figures shown in Eastman Johnson's well-known Negro Life in the South from 1859 were actually based on individuals who dwelled behind the Johnson family home on F Street, a few doors east of Anna Bordeaux Thornton and across the street from the house that had been the notorious Miller's Tavern. The lean-to shed and brick fireplace that Eastman meticulously rendered were similar to what Purcell had specified to be built for the dance. The house shed opened onto the back alley and created a lively social space around the hearth, used for cooking, a safety measure that prevented cooking-related fires in a wooden house. In the 1820 census, James, Grace, and Jerry Dant, along with another male, perhaps another son born after manumission, continued to reside in one of the structures on F or G Street. Records show that the Dants remained in Ward 2 at least until 1830. In Washington City, where free blacks from outlying plantations sought work and places to live, it was more difficult to segregate free and enslaved who worked together in private residences, businesses, and construction sites, or dwelled side by side within the block interiors. To police, surveil, and control the Williams, the Hollands, the Dants, and other black residents, the city adapted old Maryland slave codes and legislated new slave codes, which at one time applied to the few remaining Native American slaves. These laws and ordinance determined how enslaved people were brought into the region, how they could be sold, entailed, or gifted, and taxed. These rules impacted how the enslaved moved about the city, when they bathed, how they worshiped, how they could be hired out, if they could appear in legal proceedings, when they could be freed, how they could petition for freedom, and what happened if they broke any law or rule, especially the detailed statutes for runaway slaves within the city, beyond the state, and national boundaries. These codes also spelled out the numerous penalties for racial mixing that resulted in the birth of a child. Violation of these statutes forced any free man or woman, whether black or white, into indentured servitude for several years. Free blacks like the Butlers, the Hollands, and the Dants also lived under these dictates and the threats of violent reprisal if laws were broken, including, as I said, a return to bonded servitude. One such law, passed in 1820, by the Corporation of Washington City, prohibited meetings of, quote, slaves, free Negroes, and mulattoes, end quote, gatherings automatically labeled in the law as disorderly. Order of the law was broken by virtue of who gathered. For unsanctioned assembly, they punished enslaved persons by whipping and imprisonment. For disorderly gathering, free people and mulattoes were fined up to $20, and if unable to pay, forced to labor for up to 6 months. All free blacks had to register within the city by age 14 for females, age 16 for males, and show proof in the form of title to their freedom. These laws for black residents turned the metropolis of liberty into a metropolis of unfreedom. And as noted, Ann Williams Garrett was one domestic spatial type, and the alley offered another public spatial type within the black carceral landscape. Her life in Washington City after the fall unfolds in a counter-cartography constructed by its black residents. It's not known how long it took Ann Williams to recover or how long she stayed in the attic of Miller's Tavern. Williams may have remained married to her husband, though like all slaves, their union had no legal standing and was not recognized by any religious authority. Yet, in spite of her tragic loss, the distance from her husband, and spinal disability, Williams gave birth to more children, although it is difficult to know from records if any children had remained in Bladensburg with her husband after she and 2 of her daughters were sold. Williams's 3 other children, a daughter, Anne Maria, and sons Tobias and John, were presumably fathered by her husband, but rape by male enslavers and overseers was still common. Now, Miller may have agreed to purchase Williams because while she may no longer have been useful as a domestic servant due to her injuries, he would still be able to profit from her reproductive labor. Thus, in the long term, Miller owned Williams' future increase that provided him with additional labor for his various business ventures, like the establishment of a livery behind the tavern. Now, at some point, Miller permitted Williams and her children to live out, that is, away from his property, which may have been behind the tavern in a small dwelling on the 30-foot lot, on the 30-foot alley. In the interior of Block 254, Williams and her children joined an enslaved free Black population, like that shown in Johnson's painting, inside of Block 253, across the street from Miller's Tavern. Then an offshoot of the slave market that ensnared Williams and her children took root in the fashionable Capitol Hill neighborhood between the President's House and the U.S. Capitol was a disturbing development to those in the emerging abolitionist movement. 1 block west of Miller's Tavern on F Street lived the Hobans, and in 1817, the Hyde de Novilles. On the north side of F Street, across from Miller's Tavern, lived the Thorntons in their mid-block row house. So for those elected and charged with upholding the founding principles of the Constitution, these distasteful commercial activities caught the eye and ire of congressional members, many of whom during sessions lived in boarding houses around the city. Yet there was no consensus about how to address slavery in the city. Enslaved workers had been essential for the construction of the new Capitol and remained a necessary source of labor attending its public spaces, businesses, and private homes. Ryder, as you see here, portrays enslaved workers on the site to rebuild the U.S. Capitol as the frontispiece for Torrey's A Portrait of Domestic Slavery. As it were, for the reconstruction of the U.S. Capitol and President's House, badly damaged after the British invasion of 1814, James Hoban assisted with construction and supervision, and enslaved workers most likely cleared the sites of rubble. James Dant and Jerry Holland, also F Street residents, were paid as free labor hired to rebuild various government buildings. Now, in 1807, President Thomas Jefferson, as I've mentioned, banned the importation of slaves into the United States. This international prohibition, nonetheless, catalyzed a lucrative domestic slave trade. A new geography of the slave trade took root in the taverns and jails of Washington City as the region became a resource for slaves, feeding the network of Southern slave markets. Could the more onerous aspects of slavery, like the trade and its attendant violence, be reconstituted so that slave owners remained financially secure and physically safe? Many white Americans feared insurrections by enslaved Blacks, especially in regions in the South where slaves outnumbered their owners. Uprisings like the Haitian Revolution that ended in 1804, and slave revolts fomented by Gabriel Prosser to upend Richmond in 1800 demonstrated that freedom was indeed an aspiration of all men. If slavery were to be abolished, could and should the nation accommodate the needs of newly emancipated former slaves? To wade in to what was perceived as a moral quagmire, to address slavery's geography of tyranny, necessitated that the nation, the North, the South and Western territories would have to plan for how to live with or deport its free Black population. And thus, while slavery proved a moral hazard, any change necessitated political and economic reform, along with a new spatial paradigm of either integration or wholesale removal. Significantly, Torrey's lengthy subtitle appended his portrait of slavery hinted at how white citizens began to imagine solutions. Subtitle, quote, with reflections on the practicability of restoring the moral rights of the slave without impairing the legal privileges of the possessor, and a project of colonial asylum of free persons of color, including memoirs of facts on the interior traffic in slaves and on kidnapping, end quote. I loved how then they always had these very, very, very long subtitles to everything. So even though she was an enslaved woman with no political rights or legal personhood for that matter, William's tragedy caught the attention of a few congressmen. In March of 1816, 3 months after her fateful fall, John Randolph, a wealthy slaveholder and congressional representative and future senator from a prominent dynastic Virginia family, proposed that Congress establish a committee to examine how the district had become a thriving slave market, despite stringent laws on who can buy and sell slaves. Randolph was keen to clarify that his inquiry would not interfere with the property rights of his fellow slaveholders. From Randolph's perspective, the local slave market was not comparable to those in Jamaica or Charleston that received, quote, savages from their native wilds, end quote. Instead, the illegal trade was tearing away from his community, quote, the civilized, informed Negro, habituated to cultivated life from his master, his friends, his wife, his children, or his parents, end quote. In other words, enslavers like Randolph, the Thorntons, Hoban, Purcell, and others in Washington City and beyond had improved the character of their property, making it more valuable and amenable to the plight of enslavement. Yet, despite those advancements, Randolph believed that the region's hodgepodge of dank jails and filthy pens returned their enslaved laborers like Williams and kidnapped free Blacks like those who joined her in the garret to the status of, quote, beasts and cattle, end quote. Now, Randolph successfully formed a congressional committee to learn more about local slave trafficking. Torrey, in fact, provided a deposition of his findings and offered suggestions for how to limit the trade, which he eventually incorporated into a portrait of domestic slavery. Others giving deposition included Francis Scott Key, who represented many free and enslaved Blacks claiming their rights to freedom from unscrupulous enslavers, and slave traders. In his testimony, Key cited an unnamed enslaved woman, Williams, who had, quote, thrown herself out of a window, end quote. And he also mentioned other unnamed enslaved and free women, one who slit her throat and another who chopped off her hand with a cleaver to avoid being sold south away from family. So in the mind of the Virginia congressman and enslaver John Randolph, the rise of the slave market in the district and in the seat of the federal government, which, quote, prided itself on freedom, end quote, flagged a profound moral failing. I started my lectures 3 weeks ago with a reflection on Samuel Jennings' 1792 painting, Liberty Displaying the Arts and Sciences, or The Genius of America Encouraging the Emancipation of the Blacks, that were displayed in Philadelphia's Library Company, a new building designed by architect, physician, former Commissioner William Thornton. The large canvas extolled the virtues of liberty with an abolitionist message to US that promoted the British colony of Sierra Leone, where former slaves and free blacks had migrated. Sierra Leone, a crown colony, offered one model to some, especially abolitionists, for how the US could plan for the emancipation of thousands of enslaved people. And so 6 months after Randolph's committee completed its finding, and a year after William's fateful leap, a group of powerful white leaders in Washington city that included John Randolph and Francis Scott Key formed the Society for the Colonization of Free People of Color in America. Bushrod Washington, nephew of George Washington, took charge as the president, and William Thornton, a longtime advocate of colonization, served as a manager. The civil society association that became known as the American Colonization Society, the ACS, opened chapters around the nation whose members worked with local, state, and federal governments to create a pathway for free blacks to leave the United States. Settlements, as discussed in my second lecture, needed land. Though historians have debated whether the formation of Liberia was a full-blown imperial project, since it was undertaken by a private association, the ACS. After several attempts to purchase lands south of Britain's Sierra Leone, agents of the ACS signed an agreement in 1821 with King Peter, leader of the indigenous Day people, for land on the St. Paul River at Ducor, on what white traders had named Cape Mesurado, where the Dutch West India Company had established a trading fort. Since mercantile capitalism was an economic engine for the European settlement of the New World, the ACS's members saw this new region as suitable for commerce, trade, agriculture in cotton, indigo, coffee, rice, corn, and more. As a means for claiming space, the ACS reinscribed an Anglo-Northern American geography of place names. We find Bushrod Island in New Georgia Creek onto the lands of the day. Now, there were many rationales for and against ACS's self-deportation aims. The prospect of a new settlement on the West African coast proved attractive to white anti-slavery advocates, including those who wanted an immediate emancipation and those who advocated for a gradual emancipation to protect investments in slaveholding. From the perspective of some colonization supporters, deportation returned US Negroes home to Africa to live with other savages, while others like Randolph and Thornton believed that Africans and Americans in America had already been transformed and would return to Africa, bringing liberal democracy and Christianity to uncivilized Africans. For free blacks in the US, however, the proposition of self-deportation was deeply fraught, and some, like Paul Cuffey, embraced the opportunity to flee the unrelenting and deadly violence of enslavement. And while others, like a group in Washington city, refuted the notion of return and expressed their concerns in an editorial in the National Intelligencer shortly following the announcement of the ACS's formation. For these local free blacks, the US was the home of their parents. They characterized their limited freedoms as adequate, which underscored their reluctance to self-deport. They proposed, as did some white advocates against deportation, that racial mixing might be the remedy. Quote, amalgamation may speedily take the place of the detestable one of transportation and banishment, end quote. Now, one Washingtonian that took a keen interest in the new settlement was William Thornton, who, as noted earlier, had been interested in Sierra Leone's formation, by the British and had pursued a similar enterprise that might be beneficial to the US. He, like Thomas Jefferson, had spent a lifetime observing enslaved Blacks on his native Tortola plantation, on his Maryland farm, and in his Washington City household. Thornton advocated for gradual emancipation, but feared revenge given the brutality of enslavement. Thus, he supported deportation once liberated. Thornton had even suggested to President Jefferson that the US government should purchase Puerto Rico as a post-emancipation destination. But unlike Jefferson, Thornton, who came from a Quaker family of slaveholders in Tortola, did not believe that Blacks were naturally inferior in mind or body, but had suffered greatly from the degradation of enslavement. Shortly after the land of Cape Mesurado had been attained by the ACS, Thornton, who had designed and won the competition to design the US Capitol, he conceived of a design for the settlement. It consisted of a 12-foot tall stone tower surrounded by a circular stone battery with cannon emplacements. 7 avenues radiate from the battery's 40-foot buffer of a lawn, organizing blocks and lots for property ownership. Historian Robert Murray suggests that Thornton's design purposefully evoked L'Enfant's plans for Washington City, except its central defense towers represented, quote, the ever-present potential of being overrun, end quote. The settlement's main avenue, one that Thornton named Emancipation Street, terminated at the tower, which continued to place free Blacks under a regime of surveillance, even upon their supposed return home to the African continent. So even with the option of immigration to Liberia as a means to reduce Washington City's free Black population, enslaved men and women, including Ann Williams, continued to lay claim to their rights of freedom, which incrementally expanded the city's free Black population. Though she experienced a spinal disability as a result of her perilous fall, Williams and her family lived in Ward 2 away from her enslaver, George Miller, for more than a decade. Legally, however, she and her children, Anne Maria, Tobias, and John, remained Miller's property. But those conditions would eventually change. Now, even though Miller could not read and write, she was perhaps cognizant of the legal routes to freedom from her time spent in the garret with Rosanna Brown and John Parker, and from other free persons she would have encountered daily. Yearning for greater autonomy afforded by freedom, Williams petitioned the district court for her and her children's freedom in 1828. Francis Scott Key, whom she previously met in Miller's garret, served as one of her attorneys. Because Miller and his son evaded several summonses for court appearances, 4 years transpired before a trial commenced. In the interim, the Millers transported one of William's sons, either John or Tobias, probably against his will, to Kentucky to be sold at a slave market in or near Lexington. Once this was revealed to the judge, a jury trial was hastily convened in May of 1832, which halted the sale of the young boy and forced Miller and his son to show up in court. The jury ruled that the sale of Williams for $5 after her debilitating fall in 1815 was illegal, as per Maryland law, because John, the slave trader, had not been resident for 3 years. The jury approved her freedom for petition that liberated Williams and her 3 children from the onerous control of George Miller. Ann Williams and her children remained in Ward 2, working as laundresses, domestics, bricklayers, and laborers, and joining a free Black community who established schools and erected churches for themselves. At some point, maybe around the 1840s or so, Williams purchased a wood frame house on 12th Street between N and O Streets Northwest, less than a mile from Miller's Tavern, which had burned to the ground in 1819. 1 year after the start of the Civil War in 1861, Congress and President Lincoln abolished slavery in Washington City and the District of Columbia, which freed everyone in Williams' community. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution protected her civil rights, her rights of citizenship, including the right to property. Though as a woman, she could not vote, and racial animus was recalibrated into Jim Crow. Williams remained in her house, living with her daughter, grandchildren, and assorted boarders, at least until the 1880s. Shortly thereafter, Anne Williams probably passed away in her 90s, a free woman in Washington City. To conclude, I often share with my students the claim made by anthropologist Michel Rouftriot, who wrote about the absence of the Haitian Revolution from the French historiography on the period of revolutions. Triot smartly said, there is what, quote, there is what happened and there is what is said to have happened, and that the production of history happens through the gathering of artifacts, through the organization of artifacts into archives, to the writing of history and its reception. All history is power. Examining, as I mentioned in my first lecture, Dr. Lonnie Bunch shared with me that he believes that Black history often hides in plain sight, referring to, for example, the ironwork by the enslaved and free Black ironmongers found on antebellum buildings in Charleston and New Orleans. These invisible architectural details became the motif for the corona, the metal lattice structure that recalls the iron screens and sheaths on the exterior of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. So in other words, buildings, landscapes, and spaces can be archives, especially when other forms of evidence are intentionally absent or silenced in the conventional archives that historians utilize to form national historical archives. And so I hope that this series of lectures over the last 4 weeks have encouraged a reflection on the histories of the nation and the social contract that binds us in the various ways that understanding history can really fortify our understanding of the nation in which we all live and dwell. Thank you.
I want to thank you for 4 unbelievable lectures and for sharing your brilliance with us over these past 4 weeks, Mabel. And I want to thank you all for being with us today, whether this is your first lecture, second, third, or fourth. It's been great having you here, and I hope you enjoy this glorious Sunday. See you later.
Aww.